CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is The World Today.
Hello, I'm Jamie Owen. Welcome to the program. Our top stories. Ukraine's capital Kiev is under sustained assault, but holding out on day 3 of Russian military action. Conflicting reports on the possibility of peace talks as both sides blame each other for the lack of any diplomatic initiative. Ukrainian refugees pour into neighbouring countries. More than 100,000 people have already crossed into Poland alone. And from Tokyo to Munich, protesters around the world demonstrate their opposition to the Russian attacks on Ukraine. Heavy fighting is continuing around Kiev as Russian forces advance on the Ukrainian capital. An apartment block was hit as explosions and gunfire were heard across Kiev. President Vladimir Zelensky has called for the country's urgent accession to the European Union and says an all-out attack on Kiev is now imminent. Many Ukrainians are continuing to shelter underground in metro stations, while tens of thousands of people have fled to neighbouring countries. Well, let's talk now to our correspondent, Stephanie Fried, in Kiev. Stephanie, what's happening there? What can you see?
Jamie, developments here are rapidly unfolding. I'm talking to you now from the porch of the place where we're staying. The reason being that a curfew is now underway here in Kyiv. It went into effect an hour ago. That's 5 hours earlier than the nightly curfew has been implemented. And I've just gotten word, unconfirmed, that curfew, rather than being lifted in the morning, Sunday morning, will be lifted on Monday morning. Meaning the other reports that I'm also getting simultaneously of Russian troops encircling Kyiv and the intention to move on to the city overnight Saturday, that would seem to reinforce this curfew of telling people to stay at home, not to leave. Anyone seen on the streets will be considered, quote-unquote, saboteur or spy. And you've got heavily armed people here throughout the city. That includes not only military and security personnel, but also civilians. So that is the latest that we're getting from Kyiv. That a siege, as we understand from the sources that are reporting here, is imminent. At the same time, as you noted, fighting and shelling throughout the day. Reports of a Japanese cargo ship that was hit by a Russian missile in the Black Sea during the day. Also, a residential block that was hit by a missile here in Kyiv, a few kilometers away from here. We've been hearing pounding throughout the day of shelling. And also, Jamie, as you noted, the President, Zelensky, addressed the nation, addressed the international community, appealing for Ukraine's acceptance into the EU, but also appealing to the Russian population. Let's take a listen to what he had to say.
And now I want absolutely everyone in Russia to hear me. Thousands of victims, hundreds of prisoners who simply cannot understand why they were sent to Ukraine. They were sent to Ukraine to die and to kill others. The sooner you tell your government that the war must be stopped immediately, the more your people will survive.
Stephanie, how do you sense ordinary Ukrainians are dealing with what's going on?
Well, you know, as you said, people are sheltering underground in the metro stations because they're deep underground. People are sheltering, as we saw last night, people are sheltering at the train station because it's a heavily reinforced building. They don't have anywhere else to go. They're in transit, and so they're staying there. And right now, with the curfew that's come into effect, people are in their homes. And if they're not on the road, if they're not fleeing, they're taking shelter in their homes They know where their bomb shelters are, or if they have them, or where they can hide. And waiting right now, because there is very much a sense, certainly with the directives and with these latest developments, that there will be a tremendous amount of activity in Kyiv tonight. Jamie?
Stephanie, thanks for that. Stephanie Fried, our correspondent in Kiev. Well, let's next take you to Russia and talk to our correspondent Stuart Smith in Moscow. Stuart, conflicting reports about possible further negotiations, further talks between Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah, the Kremlin has said that the Russian military has been asked to continue its assault from all directions now that negotiations have failed. That's an order from the Russian President Vladimir Putin himself, but Ukraine disputes that negotiations were even ever started, because on Friday night, Ukraine says it was still negotiating with Russia about the location for any potential talks, whether it be the Belarusian capital of Minsk, the Russian preferred option, or the capital of Poland, Warsaw, the Ukrainian preferred option. That's as far as negotiations got on Friday night, according to Russian President spokesperson Dmitry Peskov. And then today, Ukraine says it hasn't talked to Russia since then, but the Kremlin is already calling these negotiations over and therefore justifying its latest offensive. The head of the Ukrainian president's office says that Ukraine is permanently committed to negotiations, is willing to negotiate ceasefire and a peaceful resolution to this, but has said says that Ukraine will refuse unacceptable conditions or ultimatums from the Russian side. And let's be clear, what Russia's asking for Ukraine here are quite an extreme and broad set of demands. Russia, first of all, would have Ukraine lay down all its arms and then recognize Crimea as Crimea as part of Russian territory, the separatist regions in Ukraine as independent. All Western military equipment must be removed from Ukraine, and Ukraine would need to withdraw its request to join the NATO military alliance, something which Ukraine throughout all of this has said it's not yet willing to do.
Stuart, are we able to gauge the domestic opposition in Russia to what's happening in Ukraine?
It's a difficult thing to do, and it's certainly not easy to express one's opinion here in Russia, especially if it goes against what the government is saying about any particular situation. But I can give a broad view of the kinds of opinions that I'm hearing. There are people, again, in the streets in Russia protesting against this war, signs reading such comments as "Not in my name" and "Russia against war." These people, of course, will have strong connections with many people in Ukraine, family, friends, historical ties. 3 million Ukrainians live in Russia itself. It's a very closely connected country, but most of those protesters that have gone out have been arrested or detained for participating in those protests. Some will receive fines of around $100, others will end up in jail for a few days, and the organisers of those protests likely to end up in prison for potentially years, based on previous government reaction to those that arrange what the government calls mass riots. The legislation being used is COVID-19 legislation and also rules about blocking the highway, but it's clear regardless the Russian government is not going to let protests get particularly large. Then on the other side you do have people that support what's going on, consider it a humanitarian intervention justified by Ukrainian actions against citizens of Russia and Russian-speaking people in the country, that the government of Ukraine are neo-Nazis and committing genocide. But then I'd say you have perhaps the biggest number of people simply in shock, unsure what's going on, feeling powerless that they can do anything to change the president's mind or even their lawmakers' mind, simply ignoring what's going on or resigning themselves to just simply watching.
Stuart, thank you for that. Stuart Smith, our correspondent in Moscow. The United Nations estimates that as many as 5 million Ukrainians could be driven out of the country by this war, with other European leaders urged to accept their share of the refugees. Poland says that more than 100,000 people have already crossed its border from Ukraine since the invasion began, with thousands more people fleeing into Moldova, Romania, Slovakia and Hungary. Well, Chunga Gadini-Williams is the head of Global Communication Service for the United Nations Refugee Agency. Welcome to the programme. Thanks for your time. What are the immediate humanitarian needs of people fleeing Ukraine and indeed those choosing to remain behind?
As you mentioned, the numbers are starting to grow, and this is exponential. As of yesterday, we had only recorded around 50,000 people who had fled across the borders into neighboring countries from Ukraine. And already by this afternoon, it was 150,000. And as you noted, the numbers continue to climb. And as people come across, we're trying to assess what the exact needs are. Obviously, right now, it's urgent basic supplies, shelter, food, clean water, healthcare, medical assistance, and that includes psychosocial trauma. But I think we'll only get a true sense of how much will need to be done in the coming days.
As the number of people attempting to flee Ukraine continues, what are the destinations realistically available to them?
Right now, we've seen that not only the governments, but the local communities in all the neighboring countries have been completely hospitable. All the borders are open. People are even opening their own homes, starting food banks within local communities and neighborhoods. So we're seeing a huge outpouring of support and solidarity. I think for the time being, most Ukrainians do want to stay very close to home. Many of them have family members that are still inside the country. They left their house, they left their pets, they left everything that they own. So I think most people would prefer to stay as close as possible. And if the situation allows, if security allows, to quickly go back. So I think right now the countries you did mention, Poland, Hungary, Moldova and Romania are the ones where we're seeing the largest numbers of arrivals.
What are the best ways, I wonder, in which the international community can provide useful and immediate support to the people of Ukraine?
I think both internally and externally. You know, UNHCR has been in the region for decades. We've been in Ukraine for over 30 years. So we still have a very large presence. We have about 115 staff on the ground. They're bunkered alongside all the civilians within Ukraine, but we're ready. In fact, even today, we were able to dispatch a few lorries filled with supplies, basic supplies. And I think it will be critical that we're able to quickly change and adapt. Right now, we don't know where the greatest need will be. It seems that people are fleeing in all different directions. And it is clear, though, that it is those life-saving measures, shelter, food, and water, health facilities. Those will be the primary things that we'll need to reinforce very quickly.
It's been heartbreaking watching the pictures of small children clearly terrified in underground shelters, hiding from Russian military action in their own homes. I wonder what the long-term implications are of this violent crisis in the years ahead.
I think this is the thing that so many of us are having such a difficult time with. We've been speaking with our own colleagues who have their families and who are based inside Ukraine. And I think even a few days ago, none of us could have anticipated what is happening. And as you say, not only people bunkered down wherever they can be, but also those people that had to very quickly leave. If you or I were in a situation where we had just minutes to leave our homes, what would we grab? Would you have the time to grab your passport, to grab some cash? What would you take with you and what would you have to leave behind? It's an impossible decision that people are making inside Ukraine today.
Chunga Gadini-Williams, thank you very much indeed for talking to us.
Thank you.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, the latest from Western Ukraine, where thousands of people are heading towards the European Union to try to escape the fighting.
Search CGTN Europe wherever you get your podcasts to subscribe to The Agenda podcast. The Agenda with me, Stephen Cole, always gets to the heart of the story. Just subscribe today and listen now.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
One more offensive in a long line of battles that's been ongoing for more...
Just got to be careful here with some gunshots. Excuse us, excuse us.
The world today matters for your world tomorrow.
The number of casualties is growing quickly.
Why, this is one of the hardest hit towns in the region.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities. Reinvent. Find new opportunities. Discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
The world has changed under the pressure of the pandemic. For many of us, life is returning to some kind of normal. As we're adapting to changes in all of our lives, let Global Business Europe be your guide to the new normal. Join us weekdays on CGTN.
Hello, welcome back. A reminder of our top stories. Ukraine's capital, Kiev, is under sustained assault but holding out on the third day of Russia's invasion. A curfew is now in place until Monday morning, with reports that the city is encircled. We're getting conflicting reports on the possibility of peace talks as both sides blame each other for the lack of any diplomatic initiative. Ukrainian refugees pour into neighbouring countries. More than 100,000 people have already crossed into Poland alone. Lviv in western Ukraine is something of a transit point for many displaced people in Ukraine trying to avoid the conflict or to leave the country. Our correspondent Guy Henderson reports.
We left the capital, Kiev, on Friday afternoon in between waves of airstrikes. It took us 18 hours. Hundreds of thousands of other people had the same idea. Initially, we headed on back roads. We headed south, away from the front line of fighting further to the north in Kiev. Within hours, the Russian military launched an offensive on an airport in that part of the city in an apparent continued attempt to encircle it. We then rejoined the main evacuation route west. After we had done that, again, within a few hours, fighting on that highway and bombs which blew up a bridge on that same road. One big question now then for people trying to leave the capital and head to Lviv, this city near the Polish border, which is considered a relative safe haven at the moment, is how possible that will still be given the military activity around the capital and apparent attempts to cut it off from the rest of the country. Guy Henderson, CGTN, Lviv, near the Polish border.
Well, let's take you to Moscow now. Andrei Kortunov is the Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council. Welcome. Good to have your company. Thank you very much for joining us on the programme. I wonder, as an internationalist, a citizen of the world, as a Russian, when you look at what's going on, what goes through your mind as you see what's happening in Ukraine?
Well, I think that we are definitely entering a new stage in the international relations, especially in Europe. It is very sad. I think that a war is always a failure of diplomacy, but now the milk has been spilled and we should assess the repercussions and the outcomes of this disaster, which will be very, very serious.
When you describe it as a disaster, do you sense that this is a misstep on the part of the Kremlin, that it simply got the whole thing wrong?
Well, I think it's a chain of events which started many years ago in 2014, maybe even earlier than that. There was, in my view, there was an opportunity to try to resolve the issue through peaceful means over the last 8 years. However, this opportunity was not used. I think maybe everybody has to take some responsibility for this failure. but it cannot justify war in any case.
We've seen hundreds of people being arrested in anti-war protests in Russia. I wonder how significant is that popular opposition to the invasion of Ukraine?
I think at this particular stage it is not that significant. We are talking about hundreds of people, but not about thousands, not about dozens of thousands. As long as the operation is relatively short and the collateral damage is relatively limited, I do not foresee any real challenge to political or social stability here. Of course, Russians will have to pay a price, but I think that this price is likely to be delayed in time because the impact of economic sanctions imposed by the West is likely to hit the Russian society with a delay. So I think that this impact can be partially absorbed by the system, which this is something that has to be recognized, which has been preparing itself for such a situation for a long period of time.
What do you believe is the end game for President Putin?
Well, it's hard to tell, but I think that definitely there are certain red lines which he articulated quite explicitly. He doesn't want Ukraine to be a part of NATO. He doesn't want NATO to proliferate into the Ukrainian territory. I assume that he doesn't want to see right-wing nationalistic forces in charge of the Ukrainian political development. So there are a couple of issues which seem to be really very important for the Russian leader.
How does Russia ever reset its relationship with the international community after this?
Well, it's a good question. I think a lot will depend on whether the West is able to mobilize all the international community to isolate Russia or not. Definitely the Russian leadership counts on positions of traditional Russian partners in regions other than the West. If you, for instance, if you look at the recent discussions of the resolution in the UN Security Council, you'll see that both China and India abstained from supporting the resolution that was very critical of Russia. So I think this is exactly what the Russian leadership counts on, that major non-Western countries like Russia, like India or China will abstain from trying to isolate Russia.
But how significant, I wonder, is China's abstention from that vote at the United Nations? It quite simply was not the wholehearted support that perhaps Moscow may have hoped for.
Well, we don't know what they hoped for in Moscow. I think they understand that China has its own views. China has very strong positions on territorial integrity and sovereignty. It has its own problem with Taiwan. It has never recognized the appropriation of Crimea by Russia. It is a large trading partner of Ukraine and a large investor to Ukraine. But I think that arguably Putin has some kind of agreement with Chairman Xi that China will not directly oppose Russia's actions, but will not explicitly support them either.
Andrei Kotunov, the Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Well, Western countries are planning more sanctions against Russia, while at least 26 countries say they'll send more weapons to Ukraine. Let's talk to our correspondent, Andrew Wilson, watching events for us. Russia is isolated, is it not?
Well, arguably it's getting that way. I mean, your previous guest, Mr. Kotunov, did make the point that there's still it's still lukewarm in some quarters. I think he pointed out that the resolution at the UN Security Council was abstained by China and by India, two significant countries in the world. So it's not a wholehearted condemnation yet. So Russia could still keep playing this gamble for some time with the hopes of being able to normalize the situation on the international stage. However, the removal of the Champions League final from St. Petersburg, the cancellation of the Formula One in Moscow, these things make a difference to the general public. And if they start to feel in general that Russia has what the West is calling a potential pariah status, or indeed that the politics of the international community are not necessarily backing the Kremlin's position. That may create a different flavour to internal Russian politics than is going on at the moment, and that might change things for the Kremlin's fortunes going forward. It's banked in a lot of this. There's a huge attack wealth fund that's been saved for this. The military operation clearly has been planned for quite some time, and so there's every expectation, one assumes, in the Kremlin for pushback from the international community. But this is already starting to drag a little bit. We're now 3 days in, and we're not really seeing Russian military in the numbers that one would expect on the cameras inside Ukrainian cities. So there's a bit of play to go yet.
Talk us through next steps, what happens next. We've been reporting on the likelihood of more weapons being sent to Ukraine, more sanctions are coming, and this row over SWIFT payments, the international payment system.
So a lot of this depends on how things fare within Ukraine over the next weeks and perhaps even longer, who knows, whether it turns into a protracted insurgency by Ukrainians against an occupying Russian force, whether the Russians sue for some kind of parley and get some concessions from the Ukrainian government for them to withdraw, whether they decide just to concentrate on the eastern. All that plays into what the West does next. But certainly we're seeing a complete change of heart as far as European capitals are concerned in terms of sending weaponry to Ukraine. They wouldn't think of it before the invasion. Now, most countries, 26 at least, are starting to consider sending actual weaponry to help any kind of Ukrainian insurgency. The banking sanctions are a matter of record. SWIFT is this system which has existed for quite some time, very popular, used by 11,000 plus banks around the world. It's not a transferring system. It's a messaging system which allows us to send money from one country to another cleanly and quickly and acknowledge it happening. If Russia were to be taken out of that, that would significantly dent again their banking procedures. However, thus far, it seems only Boris Johnson, UK Prime Minister, is pushing that hard for it. He's had some support from the Italian government today, but still the Americans and the European Union are keeping out of that idea.
Very, very quick thought on what happens next in terms of military steps.
Well, it all depends on how this campaign goes for the Russians at the moment. Thus far, it seems a matter of vague general agreement that the advance has been slower than expected. There are concentrated Russian troops, we know, north of Kiev, in the east and in the northeast as well, and pushing a little bit from Crimea from the south upwards. But that's by no means a takeover over Ukrainian cities, and that's by no means an army of occupation. If this fight continues to be fought mile by mile, rather than by 100 miles by 100 miles, well, that could indeed change the whole outcome politically.
Andrew, thank you very much indeed. Our correspondent, Andrew Wilson. The headlines again. Ukraine's capital, Kiev, is under sustained assault, but holding on the third day of Russia's invasion. A curfew is now in place until Monday morning, with reports that the city is encircled. We're getting conflicting reports on the possibility of peace talks, as both sides blame each other for the lack of any diplomatic initiative. From Tokyo to Munich, protesters around the world demonstrate their opposition to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And that is the world today. Thank you for watching. We're on smart TV apps, Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Freeview. More news at the top of the hour. Coming up next, it's The Agenda with Stephen Cole. For now, from me, goodbye.